I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm talking about something called the Greater Reset, and I'm going to be asking the question, is it possible to change the system by dropping out one by one, or can you only really drop out as a community by first changing the system? This came to my attention because I posted on one of Russell Brand's videos, and someone else had posted these 14 myths of government. And it made a lot of sense to me. They were very well written, and there was nothing that I disagreed with. So I wrote back to that person and said, oh, given these, I think that you should check out my Build a New Model video because it seems along the same lines. And you might also like the one on legal shaman and economic witches, where Yuval Harari says that nations are just a spell cast by legal shaman. And I talk about how we, as economic witches, could change those spells and make them serve the community. But they wrote back and said, I actually already have a plan. And here it is. There's the Greater Reset. There's the history of something called Agorism, which is a philosophy developed in the 1970s. And then there are things called freedom cells that tie those together. So I'm going to explain what those are, and then I'm going to explain concerns that I have about them and how I think that my system addresses those same concerns in a way that I think could be more effective. Let's look at this. The first place I was sent to learn about the Greater Reset was to someone named Derrick Broze and his Manifesto of the Free Human. In it, he explains how this was built on agorism, an idea that was put forward in the 1970s by Samuel Konkin III. So agorism is described as a radical libertarianism that uses black markets and underground economies in order to siphon power away from the market. And this is something that promotes things like free schools, competing currencies, tax resistance, and different ways of being able to help one another instead of giving that power to the state. Agorism stresses that it only uses peaceful means to bring about change, things like starting community gardens or operating a business without a license. They say there are 4 phases to agorism. The first, it might be a scattered thing, individual pods that form, and then they might coalesce into things like eco-villages or seasteaders or space colonies in their example. And then it becomes bigger and bigger until that becomes the norm rather than the state. They give examples of successful counter-economies in other countries like Peru, China, North Korea, Cuba, and Africa. Then they give 3 different places that can be used online for organizing, and those are the freedomcells.com and the nextdoor.com, and then getcell411.com. The latter was new to me, and it seems to be a mutual aid, roadside assistance, and also ride-sharing platform. And Nextdoor.com I am all too familiar with, to the extent that they have called into radio stations where I was going to go on and talk about them in order to tell them that they shouldn't allow me on because I was just a bitter, spiteful person. But I have done a lot of research into Nextdoor.com and their interference in local politics and the way in which they use bias censorship in order to present one side of an issue. The insidiousness of having Nextdoor.com be our only community forum deserves its own episode. But for now, suffice it to say that using a globalized commercial platform to talk to your neighbor is a contradiction in terms. Now let's look at freedom cells and what those are. They describe themselves as a little over 30,000 people who are in peer-to-peer autonomous groups. And some of these include Protect the Children, which advertises pedophile lives don't matter, Motorhome Survivalist Group, Freedom Entrepreneurs and Job Seekers, Northern Arizona Free Thinkers, 3D Printed Guns, and they have groups that have formed from rural Michoacan to Panama to Texas, which says it is the largest freedom cell in the world. And they say that their means is to use peaceful resistance and alternative institutions, and their goal is that every member has storable food, encrypted communications, bug-out plans, and can defend themselves. That's the first level of organizing for freedom cells. The Greater Reset speaker events include many people who I admire. Some of those are Joel Salatin, the renegade farmer who wrote Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. He has promised to write the introduction to my next book. And people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tess Lowry, another brave member of the COVID early treatment group. And then journalists like James Guzman and James Corbett. So this is something that we should be looking at and taking seriously. But I also want to critique it seriously because we only have so much effort to spend, and we need to spend it, I think, on something that's going to work. So here are the 4 concerns that I have about this plan. Number 1, we're a consumer society. In the examples given, those are all societies where people are producing. And so having a trade network is possible there, but in the US, only 2% of people are farmers. You can't have a trade network running on backyard or community gardens that's going to feed everyone if you have that kind of discrepancy. Concern number 2, it leaves banks as the default owner of all property, which means they therefore own the labor. So now banks create the money by creating the mortgages. That means they're considered the owner of everything. And if you create an alternative currency, they're not going to accept it. So that means that the only way that you can have people who are being part of this and dropping out is if you already own property outright and you don't need to pay property taxes on it. Third, I don't think it has a very deep understanding of how money works, which is something I spent 10 years researching and put into the first 3 sections of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. I felt that you really had to understand the problem before you could propose a solution. So how does money move? In the economy in the US, 94% of money is created through the mortgages. That puts it out into the economy where it gets mixed with our earned labor and then comes back to the bankers in the form of mortgage payments. The interest from that then goes to them as bonuses, which they transfer to their other hand as corporate investors. So they become the venture capitalists. And then it goes to corporate employees who then take the first slice into the taxes that fund the government, and the next huge slice goes to the fire economy, what Michael Hudson looks at as finance, insurance, and real estate. So those take up the bulk of people's income. The next trickle down goes to the people who provide services to corporate employees, and then it trickles down again. So unless you have people who are in the corporate world who are getting the first slice, the first tier of that money, you're not going to have any trickle down. It's only going to siphon out for everything that you need, I think. And my last concern is that no matter how many people drop out, I don't think it's going to hurt the system. Those who designed the Great Reset already designed the system to profit them. And honestly, they don't care if we live or die. So if you are dropped out and dead to the system, that's all the same to them. You can only be a tax resistor and not pay your taxes if you don't really make any money. And you can only operate a business without a license if you don't really make any money. So these are things that can operate on a small scale, but as soon as they try to scale up, they will get shut down. So let's look at how my plan for a decentralized, community-owned system differs from this. The first thing that I believe you have to change is that communities own the property and are the only ones that can issue credit for them. If you allow the banks to own the property for free and own all the labor for free, there's nothing you can do. You can never combat that system. So I rescind that right that was usurped from government, and I put it in the hands of local government so that they can issue those mortgages. At the same time that the community-owned public bank issues the debt, they're issuing the dollars to buy it from the previous owner, which means that you can use things like eminent domain to take back those properties that are foreign owned, those ones that are being snapped up by hedge funds or that are extractive industries from your local economy. And that means that you can also issue the money in a different currency, your own what I call community carrots, a community credit. You can issue that at the same time to pay back the loan. But you're not issuing it, of course, to the same person. What you're doing is putting it out there, I think, in terms of targeted subsidies. So everyone might have 100 carrots a month for food, for locally produced food, for well care, for all the things like child care, elder care, massage, dance, whatever it is that you want to put in there that is not sick care because you don't want to take that on. And then you can do it for home improvements, whether you're a renter or whether you're an owner. And we can keep scaling up and improving the places where we live. And then the last thing that I would put it in for is education and make it so that everyone can teach and everyone can learn. So for every person in your community, if you take 100 carrots and multiply that by your population, that's the stimulus package that's going to go into turning your consumer economy into producers. What I believe communities need is also control of taxation. And so I use the Social Security Trust Fund to capitalize my public banks, and I then can give it an 8% return on it, the investment. So that can keep it solvent forever. And I make sure that that's the only tax when something is used locally. So a 15% tax, say, for Social Security, which typically is already what's being paid, but it's being paid half by employers, which ends up hitting people who work for themselves harder. I would make that consistent, but I would make it the only tax if you're buying something from someone within your community. So if you wanted to tax dollars, say, to carrots, you could say that it takes $2 for every carrot. And so that way you give the people who live and work there an advantage, a 2-to-1 advantage over some hedge fund that's going to try to buy up your properties. You can also do a 50% tax on changing carrots back into dollars, so that if someone wants to buy something from Costco, it's going to cost them twice as much as if they buy something locally. And for people who are living and working there and earning dollars, you can give them a certain amount that they can exchange at a 1-to-1 rate, so that then you are also, as the government, being able to stockpile some dollars so that you have the ones to exchange, so that you never get into a predicament where you have to sell off your assets. My system, I believe, gives everyone something that they can do that would be equal to the cost of living in that community. Everyone can produce food, can care for other people, everyone has something to teach, and everyone can fix up a home. Those are skills that we all have that we would love to be using to help out our neighbors. And rather than requiring people to take risks and to sacrifice their security, my system has us looking at things as a community, and all it gives is benefit. And the only people whose expense it's at are those handful of bankers in the world who are really not going to miss it. It doesn't change the money. It doesn't redistribute the money at all. It lets us gradually move from that system of corporatism to a system where we're supporting ourselves within community. And it is a system of anarchy in the original sense of self-government, not independent people doing their own thing without any rules, but people coming together and deciding what the rules will be so that it is rule by rule rather than by rulers. If this is a system you'd like to start dreaming about together, check out this one on Patriarchal Pyramid or Matriarchal Matrix on Vandana Shiva, and this one on Luke Kemp called What Emerges from the Emergency. Thank you.